Welcome everyone. I can see folks logging in. We will begin in just a few minutes to allow for a little bit more time for people to join. Thanks for your patience, everyone. I think we'll just do one more minute to allow a couple more folks to join us, and then we'll start. All right, let's begin. Thanks to everyone who's joining us today for this lunch and learn about elk, their habitat, its management, as well as SHC's Stevens Creek Preserve and how that fits into all of this. My name is Emma Goldrick, and I'm the Development and Communications Manager here at SHC, and I'm the behind the scenes person who schedules these lunch and learn programs. I'm pleased to welcome my colleague, Sarah Sheeran, and our guest, Justin McVey, for today's program. Sarah is SAHC's Stewardship Director, overseeing the organization's monitoring and managing of our conservation easements and the properties we own. And Justin is the District 9 Wildlife Biologist for the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, and is the reason we're here today. He is the state's elk biologist and has graciously given us his time today so we can all learn a little bit more about elk and the wildlife management work that he does. We'll end today's session with an opportunity for Q&A, so feel free to put your questions as they come up into the Q&A or the chat. Justin, I'll turn it over to you now for your presentation.
All right, well, thanks to everybody for showing up. These virtual presentations are always a little bit strange, no matter how many times I do them. But so we'll go ahead and get started. So I'm the District 9 Wildlife Biologist, and because we have elk in my district, I get to wear the elk biologist hat. And so we're going to talk a little bit about elk in North Carolina, give you a quick history, and then kind of a where we are now. And then specifically, we're going to talk about some projects that we've been working on, a partnership that we've gotten with Southern Appalachian Highlands Conservancy on a really cool habitat project in Haywood County. So
Justin, I think you're muted.
Sorry, I hit the space bar. So can you see my screen? Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. So this is the historical range of elk. Um, you can see from the map there that they were extirpated in the 1780s due to overhunting and habitat loss, kind of that common story. So as a result of this, in the early 2000s, the National Park Service decided to reintroduce elk into the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. They got 52 elk were released in 2001 and 2002 from these two places, the land between the lakes and Elk Island National Park. And these are the Manitoban subspecies of elk, which was not the historic elk that were here in North Carolina, but it was a kind of a close relative. A little geography and kind of where we are. This red outline polygon is our current elk range, and where elk were first reintroduced was in Haywood County, in that kind of in the middle of Haywood County in that light green section. So when the Park Service started this, it was an experimental population of elk. And so during that experimental period, the Park Service handled all the management of elk on and off the park. And that included handling all of the nuisance situations. Then in 2007, the Park Service decided that the experiment was a success and that elk could survive in the park and surrounding areas. And then jurisdiction was kind of handed over to the local entities. So elk management on tribal lands would be handled by the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. The Park Service would handle everything in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, as well as the Blue Ridge Parkway. And then the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission would handle everything else, public-private land, outside of those two jurisdictions. So early on, especially when I first started back in 2012, we knew that elk didn't pay attention to those jurisdictional boundaries. So we created an agency partnership with the Commission, Eastern Band of Cherokee, and the National Park Service. And this working group initially was focused on things like population estimates. That's something that we wanted to know how many elk were on the landscape, as well as we kind of traded notes and what worked and what didn't with nuisance elk issues, and then also worked together on any mortalities that we had. Later on, in later years, we formed some more partnerships that have really become invaluable with entities like Southern Appalachian Highlands Conservancy and the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation. These two specifically have helped us quite a bit with land acquisition and habitat management. That habitat management is the portion that we're going to talk a little bit later about with the Stevens Creek property. So again, these agency partnerships are super invaluable, especially for our research efforts. As I mentioned, elk don't know jurisdictional boundaries, so being able to go on Park Service or Cherokee and also use their staff to help us has really, really been beneficial. As I mentioned, one of the elk working group's initial questions that we came up with was a population estimate, how many elk there were. So we think there's about 250 elk in the area. And originally, we would do minimum counts, and it's really, really basic. It's really the Park Service, Cherokee, and us. We just fan out for 2 days and literally just count elk. But as you can see from this picture, or perhaps you can't see, it is sometimes really, really difficult to count elk. So here I am 5 meters from an elk, and we can't even see them. And this kind of shows some of the limitations, but you can see under there, under that red arrow, the antler sticking up. I could smell this guy, but I couldn't see him. They're really great at hiding in plain sight. And so with these minimum counts, it gives us a rough idea of what's around, but it does have limitations. As you can see, that dip in 2022 wasn't, the fact that elk had declined that much. It's just the elk weren't in places that we could see them that year. And so we had been toying around with other methods of getting estimations of the populations. One specifically was spatially explicit capture recapture. So basically, it's just a capture recapture type project, but we used fecal DNA. So we formed another partnership with the University of Tennessee and USGS to fund a 5-year PhD project and create this research project. Here you can see our research objectives, and today we're really going to focus on that first one, which was estimating that elk population, the abundance, what are metrics like survival and recruitment and growth in Western North Carolina. Along with that, we also did things like determining whether or not we could have a sustainable huntable population in the area, and then, creating a practical and reliable method for estimating this population. I won't get down into the weeds too much on this spatially explicit capture recapture, but essentially what we did was we took 410 random transects throughout the elk range. Some were 500 meters and some were 1,500 meters. We would walk each one of those random transects once a year and collect scat. That DNA was analyzed, and then the folks at UT and USGS did all the analyzing to kind of come up with those density estimates. And so just from the capture recapture, we got density estimates every year for 3 years, 2020, 21, and 22. And then if we took those abundance estimates from each year and kind of compared them, we could get those metrics in between year. And those metrics that are in between really are probably more important than how many elk there are. So this is the total abundance estimates that we had. You can see 179 in 2020, 220, and then 240 in 2022. And this matched up pretty well with what we were thinking. When we do our minimum counts, we know that's exactly how many that we saw, but generally we have an idea of where are some other elks that we're not seeing. So this matched up with our estimates, and it also followed that same trend line that we saw with our minimum counts. It also really shows that benefit of doing that spatially explicit capture recapture method. With that, by surveying the whole entire area with those random transects, not only did we capture the elk that we knew about, but we also captured elk that we didn't know about. And what that did was kind of gave us some confidence that we knew where most of the elk, and we had really good population estimates. So besides the population estimates, those metrics that I talked about that were so important are summarized here. Our growth rate is at 1.125. Any growth or any number above 1 is a positive growth. So this is good news. However, it's not really fast growth, but it is positive growth. So that's great. Our survival rates were actually pretty good for our females with 89%. Our male population was 51%, which is pretty low. There could just be some, the fact that we didn't sample as many bulls as we did cows, just because there's less bulls in the population, which kind of made that number look lower. But it's something that we're going to keep an eye on. We're continuing this project for the next 4 years, and so we'll be keeping an eye on all these metrics. Recruitment 0.44, which just means basically takes about 2 to 3 years to successfully produce a calf that goes back into the population. And so all those metrics, all those numbers just really show that our growth rate is positive but kind of slow. And it's also important to remember that these numbers are range wide. It's not just one spot. So this is kind of like an average of all elk growth in the area. And so, with that good news of positive growth, and we're seeing reproduction, those are all positive things. What are the issues to overcome? One of the main issues that we have is habitat. So elk are grass obligate species. They like, pastures, open land, early successional habitat, and that is a limiting factor in Western North Carolina. We have a lot of mature forest, and not a lot of open areas, especially on public lands. And so you can see here, to revisit this slide, that a lot of national park in the elk range, a lot of tribal lands on the elk range. We have some game lands, and basically, we're doing everything we can do on Forest Service lands to create elk habitat. On the few game lands that we have, such as the William H. Silver game lands, we are basically doing everything that we can on those lands. So this particular project has been funded largely by Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation to get some of the habitat work done. So we've done things like using a fecon to create these kind of oak savannas, or on parts of the silver game land, there's actually, it was slated to be a ski resort. So there were these existing ski slopes. Again, with some funding from the Elk Foundation, we were able to go in there and kind of create these linear wildlife openings. And the elk responded really, really quickly to this management. However, we're doing everything we can on public lands, and how do we get more elk habitat on the ground? And that is where the partnership with Southern Appalachian Highlands Conservancy has come into play. And I'll turn it over to Sarah now.
Thank you, Justin. Just want to express my gratitude to you and Wildlife Resources Commission and our other partners for their ongoing support, both financial and technical, to help us fulfill our management goals for this 147-acre tract that we call Stevens Creek here in Haywood County, that is prominent in this photo. Beyond the far ridge line would be Waterville Lake, and the open areas that are shown in this particular photo are the subject of Justin's management for the property. Next slide. So SAHC acquired the property in 2017. It's the red tract that is shown, or the tract that is shown in red, kind of in photo center there. We had partners such as the National Parks Conservation Association, Mountain True, the Wilderness Society, and the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation all approach us to alert us of this high priority tract that was at risk of being developed potentially into a private hunting club. These groups had been studying the reintroduction of elk in this vicinity, and the tract was identified as an important piece and a key wildlife corridor. Just want to show you some other things in this map. You can see the blue tracts are all either SAHC-owned properties or SAHC-held conservation easements. The property, you can see, shares over 7,000 feet of boundary with Great Smoky Mountains National Park. It's located at the northern end of Cataloochee Ridge in Haywood County. Approximately 3 miles of streams flow across the tract and eventually drain into Waterville Lake. If you go to the next slide, Justin, I'll show you this one. It's not what I thought it was going to be. So the tract in the center is the Stevens Creek tract. This is just sort of a three-dimensional view of the property. The other properties that are outlined in white are SAHC protected properties in the near vicinity. But in the far back, you can see Waterville Lake and then even the Pigeon River Valley in the far background. So next slide. I guess maybe one of my slides got left out. That's okay. I'm going to keep going. So other important aspects of the Stevens Creek property is that it's adjacent to an Audubon Society, Great Smoky Mountains important bird area. The property is less than 1,000 feet from a North Carolina Natural Heritage Program natural area, which is rated as exceptional. So the property is just significant conservation property, and we're so glad that our partners brought it to our attention. So per Land Trust standards and practices and the Accreditation Commission requirements, SAHC develops a management plan for each property that we own. And not only do we document the conservation values, which are the reasons the property was protected to begin with, and which I've just outlined for you, but we also develop short and long-term management goals for our properties. And so for Stevens Creek, one of our objectives is to sort of optimize sustainable forest health. We have a forest stewardship plan that we commissioned for the property and we try to implement so that we're taking care of the forested parts of the property. We're also, the goal is to create and maintain, as Justin mentioned, high quality early successional habitat, which is, has decreased over 100 years or more in this part of the world. And so we want to manage not only for elk, but you can co-manage for migratory birds as well. So we have been actively doing bird surveys out there, generally on an annual basis. Another goal I just want to point out is that we work with partners to promote scientific research and study. And so, for instance, I'll give an example here. Our partners who are at the National Parks Conservation Association have set up several camera traps on the property, given the property's significance in wildlife conservation and connectivity. And so Justin can click. Here's a small video from a camera trap of a long-tailed weasel, which is sort of an elusive little creature, pretty abundant in North Carolina, but hard to document. And so we know that that particular species is utilizing the property. And so I'm going to turn it back over to Justin, who is going to talk about the early successional management that Wildlife Resources Commission is performing on our property with funding provided by the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation. Thank you.
So I'm responsible for putting all this slideshow together, so I apologize, Sarah, if I accidentally left out one of your slides. So this next slide here is kind of showing you where the Stevens Creek property is in relation to our subherds of elk. North Carolina doesn't have just one big population of elk. We have these different things called subherds. And one of the things that really was interesting for me for this property was its proximity to the white oak subherd. It's just over one ridge, but it's also near the landfill herd, Elk and Cove Creek, as well as Cataloochee. So the idea was to take this property, which is largely forested, but does have about 16 acres of pasture, and create a more native vegetation, kind of get rid of the fescue and those old field type things, and turn it into something that would hopefully be more attractive to elk. So here you can see we have just a monoculture of fescues and other kind of non-native grasses. So we thought, well, maybe if we can do some management, old field management type things, we can create something that has more forbs as well as grasses, something that is going to be more native and will be attractive to elk. Kind of a if you build it, they will come type of idea. We knew that we had a few bachelor elk that use this property, but we rarely saw any cow elk on the property. So that was kind of the thing that we wanted to do. Again, just to kind of give you some bearings, you can see the Stevens Creek property there in the white polygon, and so close by we have Cataloochee as well as our white oak herd in that vertical arrow there. So I thought, man, if we could get some good groceries here in that field, maybe we can pull elk, cow elk over this ridge and have a place where they can really grow and thrive. So in order to do that, one of the first steps that we did was just mowing the field. A lot of trees in there, so we came through and mowed out all that non-desirable woody growth. We then followed that up with some prescribed fire in March and April of 2023. As you can see from this picture, there's a whole lot of green there. So we weren't able to burn exactly at the time of year that I wanted. Just logistics and getting prescribed burners and those kind of things just didn't happen quite in the dormant season as I wanted, but it still was able to carry fire through the property pretty well. And it actually did really good job of knocking down a lot of that non-native fescue. However, we were seeing things like ironweed, black-eyed Susan, some asters and ragweeds, which are all positive things. But we were also seeing a lot of poplar and just a ton of blackberry, basically just too much of those two things. So we followed those up with some herbicide sprayings. The most recent one was a hack and squirt operation where we hired a company to come out and literally cut down every single poplar sapling in these open fields and spray the sapling stumps. And as you can see from this picture, I realize it's a little grainy, but you can see the amount of poplars that have volunteered and popped up pretty quickly. So another part of this whole project was not only, changing that vegetation in the pastures, but also looking at use. So we had collared animals around the area in the landfill herd and the Cove Creek herd and then the White Oak herd, but we had never been able to collar any of the satellite bulls, a little bachelor group that used this this property. We were able to do that in February of this year, and we're able to get a hold of this fella and adorn him with some brand new hardware, which takes a location every 3 hours and kind of shows us where he goes. You can see that red arrow, that's the Stevens Creek property. And so for most of the year, he hangs out there, although he did hop over the ridge to the left here and hang out in the White Oak area. Then during the rut, which is September and October, he actually moved out here, hung out in the area that we call the landfill area. Then October 7th, he decided he had had enough of rut activity and made his way back to Stevens Creek property where he's hanging out now. So this is a work in progress. We've made a lot of great strides. We've seen a lot of changes, but what are those next steps? Well, we're planning in winter 2024 and spring of 2025 to continue doing some invasive control. And also in the upper field, we're not quite seeing the regeneration of native plants that we want. It's still kind of bare. So we're actually going to go in there and till up that soil or disc that soil in hopes of releasing that native seed bank and see what we can get to grow. We're also planning on, because there's so much space, to plant some native warm season grasses and perhaps some native mix of forbs to see if we can make something that's more palatable and will kind of attract more elk. The last line there is kind of my wish list. Every year I would love to burn this big meadow, this big pasture. That would not only set back that successional level so we're not getting so many oak, or not oak, poplar trees and woody encroachment. It also just kind of rejuvenates those forbs. I think it would be very, very beneficial. And so, we've been doing this project for a few years. Do we consider it a success? Well, while we haven't seen cow elk use on the property, it does appear that bulls are making it their home, and we haven't seen an increase in numbers. So originally I only knew of 2 bulls that use the property. Now we are up to about 5 bulls, and it looks like by their new tattoos, they're really appreciative of Southern Appalachian Highlands Conservancy's conservation of this property. And we hope to see not only more use by bulls, but hopefully they'll invite the cows over as well.
I love it, Justin.
And so that's the end. You can see all the partners that we've had through the years, and very appreciative of all those folks.
Thank you so much, Justin. That was amazing. We've got a couple questions already. Would you be able to go back to the slide that is the map with the red lines on it? I think that's back from
I think those were your transects, the line, the red transects.
And could you just explain a little bit more about the process and what is that transect and what were you collecting when you walked those?
If I can ever get to it, I will. Yeah, so with spatially explicit capture recapture, basically, in a capture recapture project, what you do is you capture an animal, you mark it, you stick it back in the population, then you go back in and you try to catch another animal. If it's marked, you make note of that. If it's not marked, you mark it and throw it back. And you do that a number of times. And just by kind of recording how many times you've collected animals and how many times you've marked and how many marked animals that you have caught, you can kind of get an estimate. So that's the really, really simplified version. So instead of catching animals, we just went in and picked up scat or elk pellets, poop. So we walked these transects, literally picking up 7 pellets from each scat pile that we found. That was then sent off to the lab where the DNA was extracted and amplified. where we could get individual ID numbers. And then through that, we could figure out if we captured, quote unquote, an animal more than one time. And those are the numbers that gave us our population abundance estimates.
Thank you for that explanation. What are some typical nuisances of elk? I know that I've seen a couple pictures, but what does that look like?
For the most part, it has to do with landowners who have gardens or things like that. If you think about a deer eating your hosta, then translate that into an 800-pound long-legged herbivore, you can imagine that it does quite a bit of damage. And even though these elk have been here for 20 years, folks are used to having gardens, and some of them depend on it for, a staple for their vegetables. And then to have elk come in and just wipe them out is very, very frustrating. That's probably the biggest nuisance issue that we have. We've had a few others where, elk were messing with dogs or chasing dogs, injuring dogs. Occasionally we get one that charges somebody, especially during the rut. We get a lot of nuisance people that are feeding elk and getting too close. So that's an issue that we deal with. But I would say probably by and large gardens and fencing, they just knock down fencing. That's probably one of the biggest issues.
Justin, Kyle wants to know if you have any other hypothesized reasons that the survival probability was so much lower for male elk. Or do you think it, like you said, it just relates back to that sample size?
So our confidence intervals on those estimates were really, really wide on the male portion. Our female estimate and the confidence intervals, like how confident we were of those, were really small. But in the male population, it was really, really wide. And I think it's because there was just so few elk that were captured. With a population of 250 elk, we may have 50 bulls. So you're just going to capture more cows than you are bulls. And just kind of statistics is leading up to those low estimates. That's one of the reasons that we're continuing this project, hoping that if we increase sample size and sampling time, that will reduce that confidence interval and hopefully see that those numbers are higher. Bull elks do tend to get shot more. They do tend to get hit by cars more. They wander more. But our mortalities haven't really been enough to explain that lower number of 59%.
Mm-hmm. Kind of related to that population question, Lee has asked that, the population going from 40 to 250 is pretty impressive, but is there kind of like a goal that y'all have in mind, or like a geographic spread? Is there any precedent from the reentry of an animal into a space that you guys are using as reference?
So we don't have a goal number. The Wildlife Commission really wasn't the one that brought elk in. It was the Park Service, and then it was kind of like, hey, you guys got elk, and we were supportive of that. So we'd never had an initial population goal as far as numbers. But we are a conservation agency, which is wise use, which is hunting. So we would like to see a huntable population. And if we look at those numbers, and we look at other states that have had reintroduced elk and have successful hunting seasons, we see their numbers are around 300, somewhere around that. We have done all the modeling as part of the UT project, looking at those hunting scenarios. And so we're still kind of working through that. So I think more than perhaps a population number, it's just having a huntable, sustainable population. We want elk to be around for, my grandkids, and forever and ever, We're not really relocating elk or moving elk. We're just letting them move where they are naturally. But we are focused on creating habitat within this elk range. And the best thing about creating elk habitat is that even if elk don't use it, as Sarah mentioned, there's a whole host of species, wildlife species that do use it. And it is beneficial for a lot. So it's a win-win situation.
Yeah, it's absolutely a win-win. And can you talk a little bit more about how elk are kind of integral to that type of early successional habitat for other species?
Well, so, when you get to a certain amount, a certain number of elk, they can certainly kind of keep those succession levels down just by eating the vegetation. Historically, it was thought that elk were the ones that kind of kept the balds that we have around here in the mountains into balds. Sometimes we see that, sometimes we don't. I think a lot of it is just our numbers aren't high enough and it's kind of spread out enough. Um, but just keeping that level down and the woody encroachment, I think is going to be really beneficial.
Mhm. Um, Kyle asked, as a Madison County resident, I was surprised and excited to learn that there are elk in a small area in the county. Could you speak to the elk in Madison County? I don't know if maybe you want to go
Yeah,
back
so
to
it's
the,
just in that upper tip. If you look up here, you can see my cursor. This kind of gets over to the Madison County side. So, in Harmon, we have a small subherd that moved over in 2013. Um, there's some private developments and things kind of up in this area where there's open land and early successional habitat that they're using, but they really haven't moved out any further than that. There's a lot of open areas in Madison County, but those open areas are used livestock, pastures, cattle operations, things like that. Um, so while it's, oops, I don't know what happened there. While it's good elk habitat, it's not probably not good neighbors for folks that have cattle.
yeah, we've got a couple of questions in here about kind of are the elk moving? Where are they moving to? Specifically, like into East Tennessee in areas like Sunquist State Forest, Wolf Creek, and Cades Cove, or into high elevation balls. Or what can you speak to kind of the movement of the herds?
Yeah, so we're not really seeing a whole lot of mass movements. And really the only bald that we have in this area is Max Patch, and we don't see a lot of use of Max Patch. Um, we have some females that go up there to have calves, but the rest of the year they generally stay away from there. We've not seen anything moving towards Cades Cove. Um, there was one cow from Cataloochee that would go into Tennessee over to that Hartford area every single year, but she was really the only one. We really don't see a whole lot of movement back and forth. Well, we don't see any movement really anymore back and forth across I-40. We did in 2013 when that Harmon Den group decided to move over. But besides that, we'll see some exploratory movements in June and July. Typically, we get our young males that kind of strike out on their own, looking for, their own area and territory and looking for their own harem. Generally, they are very disappointed and then move their way back to the existing elk range.
Helpful. Sarah, maybe you can speak to this question. Joyce has asked if we can visit the Stevens Creek site.
Thank you, Joyce. Justin, can you show a map of SHC's property, maybe the one that you used from our management plan? So Joyce, the property is not open to the public. A large reason for that is because of all the active management that is happening on the property. And though you can't see it in this map, we have an inholding where a neighbor lives in the center of all of this. Yeah, right there. And so we are also mindful of her privacy as well, but we do and will lead hikes on this property at some point in the future. So stay tuned. Our outings program will post something when it's available. It could even be like a birding hike sometime in the spring, because as Justin mentioned, we're hopeful that with ongoing management, if you build it, they will come. So he's proved that the elk have shown up on the property. We're hoping that additional bird species will utilize this improved early successional habitat. We have tracked dozens and dozens of birds, some that we expect and that are pretty common, others that are migratory bird species, but we're specifically hoping to capture some of those early successional bird species who really depend on this type of habitat. So the short of it is stay tuned. We will lead an outing at some point soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Justin, we have a question from Jeff who's asked if there's any studies being done for elk in the Highlands of Roan. I'm guessing that sort of refers to like, feasibility studies. Is that something that you guys are looking into for other habitat?
So back in, I think it was probably 2013 or 2014, we did a statewide analysis of habitat suitability. There were spots that, at least on paper, looked better than where we are right now. Specifically, Caswell County in North Carolina looked a lot better. But the reason it looked a lot better was because it's a lot more open area, not as wooded. The Roan Mountain area also popped up, but we don't have any plans on relocating elk. So if we were to relocate elk from our existing herd, that's the same thing as them dying. And we have to be really careful with numbers that we remove from the herd. And then, of course, because of diseases like chronic wasting disease and other things, we don't want to bring any of that in. So we're not planning on any reintroductions of additional elk into our area.
Thank you. Jamie's asked if elk are also browsers in addition to grazers, and if these elk are more grazing.
So they're definitely grazers. However, on that whole scale, they're less like sheep, and they will graze or browse. So we do see them eating things like rhododendrons. We see them eating acorns, but that grass component, those forbs are always going to be a large majority of their diet. Liz Hillard did a study in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park years ago, and it was, again, basically just what I said, a lot of grass in there, but also she saw some browse. Really, it's dependent on what's around, but they're always going to be those open field obligate species or open area obligate species.
In the winter, do you have to supplement feed the elk, or are they self-sufficient?
They are self-sufficient, yeah. So doing supplemental feeding is, in my opinion, a bad idea. We don't want to really congregate elk or any animal unnaturally. It's a great way to spread diseases, and they just don't need it. We've got enough stuff here. Our winters aren't horrible. We don't get a huge snowpack or anything like that. So there's always something to eat, even though it might not be the most desirable. It's enough to sustain those elk, and our elk are very healthy.
That's great to hear. Are there any more questions from our attendees?
I think Josh had asked a question here. Is the NC population expanding into East Tennessee in areas like Sundquist State Forest, Wolf Creek, or Cades Cove?
No. Sorry, I thought I answered that earlier, but no, we're not really seeing any movements that way. When the Park Service originally did their analysis of the Great Smokies Mountain National Park, Cades Cove was the top contender. But as you guys all know, there's tons of bears and tons of people, and not really the best place to have a reintroduced elk population as well. But we've not seen any move that way.
Josh wants to know, what's the maximum size an elk can achieve here?
So a bull elk, you're probably looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,000 pounds, maybe a little bit more. So the largest ones that I've ever had my hands on actually went through the windshield of a Crown Victoria, and he was just north of 1,000 pounds.
Wow.
Cows are going to be somewhat less, of course, 600, maybe 700 pounds at the max. But most of our elk, your big boys are going to be around 1,000, but most of them are going to be a little bit lower.
Evelyn would like to see more pictures of the current elk. I guess we could, do you have like some sort of repository of pictures, or just follow y'all on social media?
I don't take a lot of pictures of elk because I'm always doing things, but we probably could figure out something to get some more photos out.
Evan wants to know, has CWD been found in any of the elk in this area?
No, fortunately not. So our closest CWD, North Carolina is CWD positive in white-tailed deer. However, that hasn't spread this far west. So that's really like Surrey, Yadkin County, kind of the foothills. But we've not seen it in elk. We do take CWD samples from any elk that dies, and we send that off, but we have not detected it yet, and fingers crossed that we're not going to.
Can you give any more details about the elk in this specific picture? Like how old are the calves that we're looking at, or?
Well, so this particular elk, the bull elk was collared in Maggie Valley, and then he actually went all the way into Cataloochee during the breeding season, during the rut, and I guess fathered this calf here. So that calf is about 6 months old. You can see the difference in collars. That orange one was one of the ones that we used. It's a GPS collar. The collar that's around that cow, that's a VHF collar, which is what the Park Service uses exclusively. We only use GPS collars because we're lazy.
Mary's asking, what is the status of Cataloochee area after the hurricane, and when will it be open again?
I can't really speak to that because I don't work for the Park Service. I know as much as you guys know. I've seen, the stuff in the newspaper that that road that was right beside the creek got hit pretty hard, pretty wiped out. I imagine it'll be some time before it's reopened.
Right. Well, I think unless I see any more questions, I think that might be it for us. Thank you so much for your time, Justin, for your expertise. Thank you, Sarah. Yes, Evelyn, Asheville just got potable water back. I guess that was Monday. It was very exciting. Any final thoughts, Sarah or Justin?
No, I guess the last thing I'll say, this sort of popped up in the thread a little bit, but we continue to look at properties to protect that would support not only, quality elk habitat, but would, connect some of these subherds that Justin has mentioned. So we continue to look at properties that SAHC that we can purchase that would support elk and elk management. So stay tuned on that too.
Yeah, hopefully more to come.
Yeah, and I just want to thank Southern Appalachian Highlands Conservancy for just being a great partner in the conservation of elk and the conservation of these lands. It's they've been super great to work with. So thank you for
I got
that.
you, Justin. We feel the same way.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for attending today, and we'll make a recording of this available as soon as possible. Have a great day.
Take care. Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Bye.